This is one of those stories I've avoided talking about for years. It happened when I was around 27, before I got married, and definitely before I had any kids. I was a completely different person back then. I used to do these multi-day kayaking trips a few times a year, usually somewhere along the Washington coast. I'd load my kayak on my truck, drive to some isolated put-in point, and spend 3 or 4 days paddling and camping on remote beaches. My girlfriend at the time hated it, but I loved the solitude. My family thought I had a death wish, and looking back, maybe they were right. This particular trip was in Olympic National Park, and it fundamentally changed how I approach outdoor recreation. I had been out there for 3 days, and everything had been perfect. The water was calm, the weather had been holding, and I'd had entire stretches of coastline completely to myself. That changed pretty abruptly on the third evening. I was paddling along looking for a place to camp when I noticed the fog rolling in from offshore. It wasn't unusual for that area, but this fog was dense. Within maybe 30 minutes, visibility dropped to almost nothing. I could barely see the shoreline even though I was only about 50 yards out. The temperature dropped fast enough that I started getting concerned about hypothermia if I stayed on the water. I needed to get to shore immediately. The problem was, I couldn't tell where I was anymore. The fog had disoriented me completely, and the coast all looked the same in limited visibility. I paddled toward what I thought was a beach and ended up hitting rocks instead. I managed to get around them and found what felt like a proper landing spot. I dragged my kayak up onto the sand and immediately started looking for a place to set up camp before it got completely dark. The beach was narrow, maybe 30 feet wide at most, with a steep forested slope rising up behind it. Not ideal for camping, but I didn't have much choice. But I saw there's something that made me feel incredibly lucky. There was a structure partially hidden in the trees at the edge of the beach, maybe 100 yards down from where I'd landed. As I got closer, I realized it was an old ranger station or maintenance building. It was small, maybe 12 by 15 feet, built from weathered wood with a corrugated metal roof. There was a covered porch area in front, and a door that looked relatively intact. I honestly couldn't believe my luck. I knocked on the door out of courtesy, even though the place was clearly abandoned. No response. I tried the handle and it opened easily. Inside it was musty and dark. I pulled out my headlamp and looked around. There was a bench along one wall, some metal shelving units, and what looked like it had been a small workspace. I didn't waste any time. I went back to my kayak and started hauling my gear up to the building. It took 3 trips to get everything, and by the time I was done, it was almost completely dark. The fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. I set up my sleeping bag on the floor near the bench and organized my food and other supplies. I had a small camp stove, so I made dinner right there inside the building. The whole situation felt comfortable. I was out of the elements, I had food and water, and I could wait out the fog in the morning. It wasn't until I'd been there for maybe an hour that I started really examining the space more carefully. There were marks on the walls that I hadn't noticed at first. Most of the scratch marks are near the door and windows. I checked the door more carefully. The lock was a simple deadbolt, but there were holes drilled into the door frame on the outside, like someone had installed additional locks or latches that were no longer there. The inside of the door had gouges and scrapes around the handle area. After watching all this, I started feeling uncomfortable. Something about this place wasn't right. This was an old government building in the middle of nowhere. It could have been used for all kinds of purposes. Maybe they stored dangerous materials here and needed extra security. Maybe squatters had broken in and damaged things. There were a dozen explanations that didn't involve anything sinister. The fog wasn't going anywhere, and I definitely wasn't paddling back out in those conditions, so I decided to just lock the door and try to sleep. I wedged the bench against the door for extra security and settled into my sleeping bag. I must have dozed off around 10 p.m. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. I lay there trying to figure out what had woken me. The building was completely silent, but I can hear the footsteps on the porch. My first thought was another kayaker or hiker who'd gotten caught in the fog, but then I realized how unlikely that was. This beach wasn't on any established route. The fog was still thick, and it was the middle of the night. Who would be walking around out there? The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, listening. For about 30 seconds, nothing happens. Then whoever it was tested the door handle. It didn't turn because I'd locked it, but I heard the mechanism rattle. They tried it twice more, each time a little more forcefully. Then the footsteps moved away, circling around the building toward the back. I heard them stop at what I assumed was the window. There was a scraping sound, like something being dragged across wood. I sat up as quietly as I could and grabbed my headlamp, but I didn't turn it on. I just sat there in the dark, trying to understand what was happening. The scraping sound stopped, and then I heard a new sound of breaking glass. They were smashing the window from outside. I heard boards creaking, like someone was trying to pry them off the frame. My brain was screaming at me to do something, but I was frozen. Then I smelled the gasoline. The smell was overwhelming and immediate. Someone was pouring gasoline through the broken window. I heard liquid splashing on the concrete floor on the far side of the building. I grabbed my pack and stumbled toward the door in the dark, fumbling with the deadbolt. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip it. I finally got it unlocked and shoved the bench out of the way. As soon as I pulled the door open, I heard a whooshing sound behind me and felt intense heat. They'd lit it. The entire back half of the building was on fire. I ran out onto the porch and immediately saw someone standing about 20 feet away in the fog. It was a man, I think, wearing dark clothes. He had something in his hand, probably the gas can. We made eye contact for maybe half a second, and then I just bolted. I ran down the beach in the opposite direction from my kayak, away from the building, away from whoever this person was. But that man was chasing me. The fog made everything surreal. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and the beach was uneven with driftwood and rocks everywhere. I tripped twice but managed to stay upright. I have no idea how long I ran. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like they were going to give out. Then I hit water. I'd reached the end of the beach where it curved into a rocky point. The tide was higher than I realized, and there was nowhere else to go except into the ocean or back toward my attacker. I turned around and saw a figure emerging from the fog, maybe 30 yards behind me. He was walking now like he knew I was trapped. I did the only thing I could think of. I waded into the water and started climbing over the rocks of the point. The water was shockingly cold, and the rocks were slippery with algae. I cut my hands trying to grip them, but I kept moving. I got around the point and found another small beach on the other side. This one was even smaller, but it had a narrow trail leading up into the forest. I took it without thinking. The trail was steep and overgrown, but I climbed as fast as I could. Branches whipped my face and caught on my clothes, but I didn't stop. I must have climbed for 10 or 15 minutes straight before the trail leveled out. I found myself on what looked like an old logging road, completely overgrown but still somewhat passable. I kept moving. I had no idea where I was or where this road led, but it didn't matter. I just needed to get away. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, I saw lights in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was a highway, an actual paved road with occasional car traffic. I have never been so relieved to see civilization in my life. I flagged down the first car I saw, which turned out to be a pickup truck with an older couple inside. I must have looked absolutely insane, soaking wet, bleeding from my hands and face, wearing camping clothes in the middle of the night. They were understandably hesitant at first, but I managed to convince them to call 911. The police showed up maybe 20 minutes later. I gave them my statement, told them about the ranger station, the fire, the person who chased me. They asked if I could take them back to the location, but I honestly had no idea where I was. I'd run through fog, swam around rocks, and followed an unmarked trail to an old logging road. Finding that specific beach again would have been nearly impossible, especially in the dark. They took photos of my injuries, the cuts on my hands, some burns on my jacket where embers had landed, and said they'd send someone out to investigate when daylight came. I never heard back from them about what they found, if anything. My kayak and all my gear were still on that beach somewhere. Insurance covered most of it, but I had to lie about how I lost everything. Couldn't exactly tell them I abandoned my equipment while fleeing from someone who tried to burn me alive in a ranger station. I spent about 4 hours at the hospital that night getting cleaned up and checked out. The cuts on my hands needed stitches, and I had some minor burns on my arms from the fire, but nothing permanent. The doctors said I was lucky. I told myself I'd never do solo trips anymore. The police speculated it might have been someone using that area for illegal activity, drugs probably, who saw me as a threat or a witness to something I didn't even know was happening. That theory made as much sense as anything else.